I've always been somebody that wants to understand why, and I like telling people why things are. I love explaining things to people. And I started off, and I still do, lots of written blog posts. But I have teenagers too, and I look at my teenagers, and I had a hacking competition. Like I was trying to get my son, who was doing computer science, like let's do a little bit of the hacker ethos. Like let's build a little project because he was just doing textbook learning, and I was like, we need to go beyond that. And it took me forever to kind of persuade him to like do a little project. And I was like, okay, we'll build, like, he likes Discord. We'll build a little bot for Discord that tells jokes, right? Nothing too
Okay.
complicated, but it takes a little bit of thing to do. And so the
Yeah.
goal was we set aside one weekend to finally do this. Um, I go, I do the research, right? I kind of build the bot.
Hi, friends, and welcome to this very exciting episode of Leading with Data. Today, I have with me Rajiv Shah, who is currently part of AI and ML strategy function at Snowflake. And he brings an immense experience both as a engineer, a scientist. He has spent time in academia, so there is so much to learn from him and his experience. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Rajiv, welcome to the show.
Uh, Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to talking.
Great. So, Raji, before coming to the call, I went through your LinkedIn profile, and the first thing I noticed there, in terms of how you, introduce yourself, is that, and I'll, try and recollect it as verbatim as possible. So you say that when you were in military, your nickname was the Y guy, and no matter what you asked, you were always inquisitive, and that led you to data science. So can you elaborate a bit on that, why that name came up, and then how did your journey in data science start?
Yeah, I mean, so it started with this observation about myself that I myself didn't realize. It was until people confronted me and pointed out that, hey, whenever we give you an order, whenever we ask you to do something, you don't just do it, Raj. Like you take the time and you always want us to explain exactly why we're doing it. And I was just doing
Mhm.
this, like it was unconsciously I was doing it, but it gave me a little bit of reflection after I learned that I engaged in this behavior that I really care about how things work. I like to understand and take those apart and know why I'm doing something in that way. And so I think that part of me is something that's been reflected in both my time in the military, but also my journey in my career ever since. Is I've always had this quest for trying to understand things.
Right. And obviously, it's a great asset to have when you are in, analytics and data science and machine learning. But can you share a few examples of, places where, this really became a great asset or a great trait as a professional?
Yeah. So, I think, I ended up here in data science, but I feel like I would have ended up no matter where I kind of started, because it's a nice place to end up for people that have lots of questions because you have lots of data that's in piles that isn't organized. And if you like to ask questions and understand, the data will reveal that, but it just takes some manipulation and some organizing to be able to do that. So, along my journey, it's been fun for me to kind of solve different types of problems, kind of where I've been able to use this, whether it's working on things like cybersecurity, where we're trying to track down like the little needle in the haystack of who's acting inappropriately. Um, Whether it's looking at things like injury data and trying to figure out, what are the most common, what are the most hurtful injuries, and being able to take all these data, this numbers, jumbles of letters, and be able to tell meaningful stories that actually lead to change. And that's an important element of being able to care about why. Is at the end of the day, we need to make action, to talk to people, and people always want to know the why, right? Like if you try to
Yeah.
make your manager do something, they're going to immediately say why. Like we need a rationale. So being able to bring that in,
Correct.
using data, using analytics, using models to be able to help with that why is often really important to tell different stories.
Great. And your journey has had a mix of time spent in academia to some of the most exciting organizations, including DataRobot and Snorkel AI. Companies which are really pushing the envelope on AI and ML, Hugging Face and Snowflake. So can you share your story from your perspective and how this happened, and then what were those key decision points for you?
Yeah, and I'll go back a little bit, like how I got into this. So,
Right.
when data science for me was not a career I studied for. I did not go to undergraduate school and try to learn data science or statistics. This was something that came later to me in life. And it was one of these things that I was looking for a career change. And I saw data science and I was like, I'm good at computers. At the time, I was a computer sys administrator. I'm like, I'm good at computers. I know a little bit of
Mhm.
programming. I took a few programming classes back in the day. I knew a little bit of statistics. So I felt like I had the raw tools to do this. And because there were so many resources that were publicly available, software and tools that were available through the open source, things like R and Python, I was able to kind of take myself and do lots of little projects and gain confidence that I could use these. I'll give you an example. Like one of the first projects I
Mhm.
did is I saw a news story about the relationship between crime in Chicago and the temperature. Yeah, as it
Wow.
gets hot, right? I mean, we can feel this in our souls, right? Like we all get irritated when it gets hot and stuff. So I was just like, well, is there a relationship between the two? And so this is one of my
Mhm.
first projects. It's still out there on GitHub. It's I did this over 10 years
Wow.
ago, but I just looked at the crime data, looked at the temperature data, and just wanted to see what is that relationship? It's just a simple kind of correlation and plotting. But for
Mhm.
me, right, that ability to do that was really powerful, and it kind of let me know that I was on the right track and I could use these data to solve the problems. You know,
Interesting. And did you know R and Python getting in? So were you using Python scripts as part of your system administrator things, or
no,
that was new to you?
I started. This was about 10 or 12 years ago, and it was before really the huge emergence of Linux and Python. So this is the
Yeah.
back in the Windows era, and so I was a system administrator mainly dealing with Windows computers. So lots of GUIs, things like
Yeah.
PowerShell. But no, Python was like a weird language at the time that was just at the fringes. It wasn't nearly as mainstream as it was today. So no, I started off by learning R, which I felt like was
Mhm.
really useful if you understand how spreadsheets work. Like it wasn't too much of a
Yeah.
leap to go into R. And
Mhm.
then later, as I moved into learning more of the deep learning technologies, where Python is much more kind of the flavor that you need, I learned Python along the
Yeah.
way there.
Interesting. And I think given that you learned R first, I think, and then we'll discuss this later. Your YouTube channel also talks a lot about importance of statistics, and then R is, at least at that time, was way ahead of Python and in some of the libraries it had. So great to hear that. And then, so when you decided to move, what happened next? And so you were doing obviously these hobby projects and exploring these data sets on the side. How did you break into data science?
Yeah, and I was at a time where data science was still kind of it was hot, lots of people wanted it, but it wasn't like today where you have so many courses and so many people. And so by having that portfolio of projects that I did, I was able to use that to kind of leverage and join the data science team at State Farm, which was one of the first big companies I worked at as a data scientist.
Hmm.
And that was a lot of fun.
Interesting.
There was about 20 data scientists. They just created a new team. They put us down in a basement room and kind of we worked on all types of projects from things like cybersecurity to actuarial. Because, right, if you think about it,
Yeah.
insurance at the heart of it is all about using algorithms and using models because they need to figure out, how long are you going to
True.
live? Are you likely to get in a car accident? Is your house likely to be damaged? And that's all done, for the last, 50, 60 years by classic algorithms. So that was my kind of my start there. I live in
And then
Central.
how were
Oh, good.
those how were those days? Because so actuarial is a very interesting domain in the sense that it's very obvious that the more data you use, the better model would be, and in some of these tools and techniques can be used there, but at the same time it has its own set and procedures to follow to do the pricing, right? So I've always felt that insurance has that almost sort of conflict between how many advanced tools and techniques to use versus how much So how was it for you? And then did you also come across some of these
Yeah,
challenges?
I like working on the actuarial side. I like working with actuaries. It's a fascinating area where I think a lot of data science, a lot of machine learning could still learn from it because it's been doing it a lot longer. It's been
Yeah.
having to think about kind of working with large data sets. It's been thinking about working with regulations, making sure we can explain and interpret the models, which has also limited the ability to use some of the latest kind of machine learning models. So sometimes it feels like kind of they're in the dark ages or the stone ages when you look at the
Yeah.
tools that they're using, but they're actually fairly sophisticated with those tools like that. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. And so that was one thing where I came in working with actuaries thinking, look, I got the latest, greatest tools. Like I've read the latest papers, right? I know this Python stuff. I've got this new Java library. Like I'm going to do better than all this other stuff that they've been using, right? They used SAS, which is a widely used tool in industry for that, but
Oh.
basically building simple linear models. And I was like, no, I'm going to do much better than that. And they quickly humbled me kind of with, how well they knew their data and how well they could
Yeah.
kind of squeeze the information out of it. So I think, it also taught me a great respect in working with that for domain knowledge. The people that are on the
Correct.
ground that understand the data often understand the nuances, the issues with it that if you just suck down the data and start analyzing it without that, you're going to miss out on a lot. And I think that's something that we often kind of overlook when it comes to data analytics is thinking about, who are the person there that's been working with the data for 20 years that wrote the survey form for collecting the data that understands why we code why each of those column names have that name in there because those people often have great insights into the relationships and why the data is right back to that why story. They
Mhm.
help understand that. And to be a good data scientist, to be a good machine learning engineer, you need to understand that so you can leverage that the best. You can create the best features or variables based on that information.
Interesting. And then after I think spending about 2 years with State Farm, you moved to Caterpillar, if I'm right.
And for people that don't understand the industries, I felt like insurance, I was in the dark ages. Like, come on, like you don't think of an insurance company as very advanced
Yeah.
in terms of that. But then when I went to Caterpillar, I realized that insurance,
Yeah.
insurance and financial services are much farther
Far
ahead
ahead.
than many other industries in working with data
Uh,
like that. And so that was a quick lesson I learned at Caterpillar there. But no, I mean, Caterpillar had another set of interesting challenges where, for example, they have a global supply network of literally hundreds,
mhm.
thousands of different places that have all these different parts that come together to build kind of an excavator or a truck like that. And it's just a fascinating problem of how to ship and how to get all of these things from the right part, or thinking about, should I use a very expensive part on something or should I use a cheaper part that might not last as long, right? These are the trade-offs we have to think about. So there was lots of interesting problems to still when I was at Caterpillar to work with.
Interesting, interesting. And then you joined DataRobot, and then fundamentally it's a different company. I'm presuming a lot smaller, much faster growing. So how was that
Yeah.
transition? What was your role there, and how were those days?
So I was attracted to DataRobot because, I had worked at State Farm, I'd worked at Caterpillar, but at the time, like I could only work on a couple problems at a time. And when you go to
Mm.
a company that works in the AI tooling space that sells pieces to data science teams like that, you get to see a lot more problems. So when I was at Data Robot, like I could in the morning I could do healthcare, in the afternoon I could do manufacturing, I could do it, a churn or financial services problem, the next day or fraud. And so part of it was just the excitement of getting to work with a lot of other machine learning experts. They had lots of top Kaglers, for example, people that win data science
Yeah.
competitions working there, as well as being exposed to all these use cases. So it really just accelerated my learning around machine learning.
Interesting. Interesting. And for you personally, how was that switch, right? So going from a very structured environment to working across these different sectors, different problems, and what were some of the key learnings you had to go through this transition?
Yeah, and this is where everybody has to decide, like, what is the type of organization that best fits them. For me, like, you can
Mhm.
tell, like, I have a lot of energy. I like to do a lot of different
Yeah.
things like that. So for me, the kind of the simple, like, hey, here's 2 or 3 projects, do your meetings, do your things, clock in at 9, finish at 5 o'clock. Like that style wasn't for me. I like to do a lot of different things. I like to stay busy, be very involved, and so working at something like a startup like a DataRobot was much more interesting and kind of fulfilling for me, where I could wear lots of different hats, where I could do evangelism, I could where I'm writing blog posts or writing articles about it, or but I could also put my head down and code out a solution and build a model for a customer. I could go do an educational seminar, talk to some executives about how the technology works. And so for me, that kind of interaction like that was just I love that kind of stuff.
And I'm presuming because this was where you spent quite a bit of time.
Mhm.
COVID happened during this period, so if you have to now reflect on that period, what were some of the key learnings which shaped you as a professional, and then what are some of the things which you took forward from that period?
Ooh, I'm tr- I, it's not an easy question. I think I learned a lot about
Hmm.
machine learning as a whole, just simply in there. But
Hmm.
that time at DataRobot where I could see lots of other organizations and how people were implementing AI also gave me a very good understanding of like what it takes to actually solve a problem within an enterprise setting. It's not
Hmm.
simply sitting down with the data and building a good machine learning model. That's only
Yeah.
part of what it takes to actually kind of solve a problem and bring value to an enterprise. And I think that was one of the big
Hmm.
lessons I learned is just the difficulty of doing that, um, by
Hmm.
being able to kind of be in DataRobot and see how different organizations were doing different things differently and watching all of that.
Yeah. Interesting. And then, yeah, I think a lot of times people assume that, if they've worked on a POC or a model, that's what goes into production. The real life obviously is entirely different. And then, in an enterprise context, you are adding a lot more complexity to that as well. Great. And then you switched from Data Robot to Snorkel, and so can you
Yeah.
share?
So DataRobot was my first taste of being in this industry around tools, and so when I left, it was kind of at an all-time high around kind of building state-of-the-art auto ML for everybody like that. So it was a great challenge. Like I had been there from the company. I think when I joined had about 150 people, and I think when I left it was like 12 or 1300. And so it had been
Wow.
4.5 years. I was ready for another challenge, and so that's when I moved over to Snorkel, which was building data centric AI, which I felt like was the next big thing because now we have the
Mhm.
tools for building lots of machine learning models. But one of the things we quickly realize is it's the quality of that data going into the models has a big impact on the performance of those models. And so that's what Snorkel was kind of taking on that challenge of how we can get people to think about the quality of the data going into the models and improving that piece there.
And how does Storkel do that? So let's say compared to a data robot auto ML approach, and not necessarily from product perspective, but from philosophy
Mhm.
perspective, the philosophy behind the product versus let's say how Snorkel was trying to do it. How does that the thinking change?
So one of the things Snorkel was trying to do was to tackle the problem that people have lots of data, but it needs to be labeled. And often the way we get
Hmm.
data labeled is we just put a bunch of humans in a room and we just have them go down and say, is this a happy review? Is it a sad review? And you just go down. But that, of course, takes a lot of time to have humans do that. And especially when you get to problems, for example, with legal or medical, where the experts cost a lot, it can become very hard
Yeah.
to get that labeled data. And we know the quality of the model depends on the labeled data, because if you only have a little
Of
bit of labeled
course.
data, your model isn't going to be as good as if you have a
Yeah,
lot of labeled data.
yeah, right.
So what Snorkel helps out is they have tools. This is weak supervision is kind of generally what it's called, but they have tools for going from a little bit of labeled data and using some automation to label lots of data. And then you can use that lots of
Interesting.
data to be able to have a better quality model at the end.
Hmm. Interesting. So they're using semi-supervised approaches to essentially scale up the labeling part. And then how accurate are those in general? And then how do you deal with those errors which happen in this labeling
Yeah.
data set?
So the fundamental way Snorkel working is it's trying to use a little bit of automation or some rules of thumb, you can think about it, to label that other data.
Hmm.
So it doesn't work in every scenario, but in some scenarios it works quite well. And one of the advantages of going through the Snorkel approach is you spend a lot of time looking at the quality of your labeled data. And so often you can detect errors, identify issues, end up with better quality labeling data because you're spending some time doing that. And I think that's one of the, of course, you get a better quality model,
Interesting.
but understanding like
Yeah.
your labels distribution, understanding how the different categories inside there is often really useful as well for thinking about your problem.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And then you, I think, move from Snorkel to Hugging Face, which, in a lot of ways, is again a very unique company, uh, driving open source, open, community platform, and at the same time, reaching out to enterprises, having its own go-to market. So can you explain, your role at Hugging Face? What were some of the key challenges, the trade-offs between, community versus your own go-to-market?
Yeah. So Hugging Face was a company I had been following kind of long before I joined them, right? They were building kind of this amazing tools very early, focused on natural language
Yeah,
processing, text use cases, but then later, lots of other
yeah,
use cases where with a couple of lines of code, you could build a state of the art, what we called architecture transformer model like that. They just reduced that learning curve down very simply to make that. Just like when I was at DataRobot and I liked
yeah,
AutoML for how it allowed lots of people to build models, I saw the same things with Hugging Face. And because they were making their models open source, they were available to everybody. So I was really
yeah.
drawn to that and kind of all of the potential there. And so, when there was an opportunity to kind of join that team, I immediately kind of jumped into that and joined that. And Hugging Force is this very special place. It's all about the open source, and so they
Yeah.
spend their efforts building out the software, the packages, things like transformers, diffusers that people use, as well as providing infrastructure. So this is the Hugging Face hub where everybody kind of
Yeah.
goes and stores their models. They go run web apps like that, and just using that to create an open source community. And I can tell you there's been ups and downs when I was at Hugging Face. I think about
Hmm.
probably a year ago or so at this point, where an OpenAI had released ChatGPT for a month or two, and everybody was looking around
Yeah.
like what is the open source going to do? Or you look at the open source tools, and they were way behind. Everybody was like, "Oh no, is this the new paradigm that we're going to be dominated by these proprietary companies, kind of just like we were 10, 15 years ago by companies like SaaS?" But over the last year, you've seen how the open source community has come together where, companies like
Yeah.
Meta and Mistral and others have built open source models, shared them out publicly. And, Hugging Face has been at the center, at the heart of all of that, whether it's, the
Correct.
tooling, whether it's the legal policy around that to kind of grow that open source community.
That is true. That
Mhm.
is true. And then I think the contribution again is phenomenal. The Transformers library, which you mentioned, right? So kind of taking all of the complexity and then making it really easy. And then doing that, I think again and again with different libraries clearly stands out. And, while you were there, what sort of growth did you see? And then, because this would have been a almost explosion of interest and users on the platform. So,
Yeah. So when I got there, I think there was something on the order of about 50,000 different models that were hosted on the Hugging Face hub. So as of this date around now, I think the number is closer, well over 1 million models. Some are private, but
wow.
many are public that are hosted at the Hugging Face hub. There's millions of people that come every day to the Hugging Face Hub to kind of use the models, use the web spaces. So just the amount of interest like that has just, it's like a hockey stick. It's just grown up grown up
Yeah.
like that, and you see it everywhere. If you go on LinkedIn, you look on Twitter, Threads, whatever your social media of choice, you'll see many things that talk about Hugging Face, right? Many posts by us as well. So.
Yeah. And then you have now recently joined Snowflake. So, what is this transition and what would your role at Snowflake is? And then what does your day look like?
So I decided to join Snowflake because I saw one of the transitions, one of the issues that I had, a lot of enterprise customers that I had was they needed a place where they could do their AI, their machine learning that was safe and secure, that was close to their data. And so this is where I kind of looked
Mhm.
around and I see, there's a couple of companies in this space like that. And I really liked the Snowflake philosophy in terms of how they were building out things, how they were making things easy to use, but still being able to handle large volumes and being able to embrace the open source. So I can use any of those types of models, within my Snowflake ecosystem to build machine learning models like that. So for me, I feel like this is a solution for many companies that are trying to do AI ML, but are kind of also Snowflake customers is bringing that to them.
Wow. Okay. So, talking a bit about the trends in the industry and the changes which we have seen, right? So for you, what was the aha moment about generative AI, and then when did you see, and then any particular instance which you remember, which showed the potential of generative AI to
So I had seen, these models like GPT-3 and Bloom,
you?
for a long time. I had been slowly introduced to these through
Correct.
kind of question and answer and summarization models along the way. And they were interesting to me, but I was just like, I felt like there's only a small set of use cases. We need to kind
Right.
of do this summarization, and the quality wasn't that great. I mean, for me,
Mhm.
I will tell you, and it's a bit cliche, but my real moment was seeing how well ChatGPT worked and how much other people liked using it too. Like that, I think OpenAI did an excellent job with building something that really worked for most
Yeah.
people. While, and I think this is the important thing, including the safeguards there, so that way the model, it doesn't become kind of racist or kind of, lie to you in obvious, painful ways like that. And so they did an excellent job of really setting a very high standard compared to all the previous models that we had there. And I think luckily for all of us, nowadays, all of us are now meeting that high standard. And I think the open source has been building models
And
at that high standard. But I think that was a big piece of setting that high standard, showing what's possible. And I think we're still absorbing and trying to figure out all the use cases that we can do with that high standard. I mean, we see some common
correct.
use cases like chatbots or kind of question answer systems using things like RAG, retrieval augmented generation. The other thing I think that excites me, and I think will have a huge impact, especially on your audience, are the code generation tools. So things like GitHub
Yeah.
Copilot. I think we're now living in an age where anybody that's programming, writing code, or even a little bit of code is going to be using one of these tools along with it. And I mean, I can tell you from my personal experience, it makes a ton of difference in productivity. You can also see in the studies that have been done, it has a huge influence on
Yeah.
productivity as well.
Right. And then from your experience, if you have to put a number on the productivity gain you've seen specifically in coding, what would that be?
So the numbers on the productivity gain are all over the place, right? You have folks like GitHub, right, kind of self-promoting themselves, saying, right, it's a 50% increase, and you have more measured studies showing, hey, by Google, for example, showing a 10% improvement. So
Yeah.
I think the nature of the improvement also differs quite widely for the task. right? Is this something that you're doing
Yeah,
that's a repeated thing that is other people have done before, so the code generation knows it, versus I'm working on something very unique that isn't in the training data set, so the code generation tools can't help with. But for me, I mean, they're going to have a big impact. Now, I don't think they're necessarily going to take away any jobs like that. I think they're just going to make us all much faster. And I don't think they're going to take away that many jobs because they're not that good. Like they can do
yeah,
some things, but it's not like you can just give it a task and just let it by itself to do that, right? If you do that, it'll probably take a month of trying and trying and trying and trying and drive your costs up quite a bit if you try to have it do something by itself. So I don't fear that at all, but I think especially for folks that are just programming a little bit during their day where it's not entirely their full-time job, it's a massive boost to productivity for those folks.
yeah. That is true. That is true. And so you mentioned these two trends specifically. One of the key questions, and I'm sure this comes up in your day-to-day role a lot more, is enterprises who want to use AI and ML strategically. What are some of the questions or ways which they need to answer or address? So let's say I'm a large enterprise and I want to use generative AI in the organization. What do you think is the best way to approach the problem? And what are some of the key learnings you have had in this experience?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I think one of the things with generative AI is it can solve a lot of different tasks very differently than previous technologies. So previously with AI, we'd have discriminative AI where the models would predict a category or some type of classes, is it A, B, or C, or D? With generative, right, these models create information. And so it opens up a whole new set of use cases like that. So we can have it, for example, generate emails for us or generate answers for us. It also
Or
makes it, yeah,
documentation. Yeah.
it also makes it much more difficult to evaluate than, is this model doing this correctly, which is one area of it, but also leads to, is this model doing something that's inappropriate or that's offensive or just plain wrong that we also need to guard at. So when we go to thinking about doing this in the enterprises, on one hand there's the use cases, but there's the evaluation, and there's also the productionizing where we have to think about using tools like red teaming, where we have folks that actively try to push the model to do things that are wrong. You can think of it like a stress test because we want to make
Mhm.
sure we catch that before we put that out into production. And so I think that's the biggest change for enterprises that are doing things like AI ML and are just adding generative AI into that.
And from your experience on working with these, enterprises, so what are some of the common roadblocks which they come across, and then what are some of the things which you would want the organizations to think more proactively as opposed to coming across the hurdle and then trying to solve
Yeah, I mean, we could be here all day on the roadblocks. I mean, there's many things, right?
it?
There's right the quality of
Yeah.
data, organizing data so you can have good pipelines. Like investing in good data engineering is always important. There's the talent gap right now because there's not a lot of folks that are up to speed on transformers and generative AI. Now it's gotten better over the last year, but I think that's still an issue for many organizations. Have to kind of give their folks a little bit of time to skill up on these technologies um, as well. Um, there's that. There's the infrastructure and resources that you need. Right, many of these models for training require things like GPUs. So if you're already using kind of AWS or Azure and you already have access to those, that makes it a little bit easier. If you're totally on premise, that's a real challenge. But we also know there's a GPU shortage, and so I also have lots of people coming and trying to see if they can have access to GPUs, and that's another issues. When we get to thinking about deploying these models, we might have built some MLOps pipelines and some organization and process around that, but now it's got to change and evolve with generative AI. Our monitoring solutions have to do that. So like up and down the entire kind of machine learning pipeline, like it's causing changes across all of that piece like that.
That's true. That is true. And uh, for people who are entering this domain, now, right? There is so much to learn, so much to kind of follow, and so much development to keep a track on. What are some of the pieces of advice you have for them? How can someone who is just entering this domain keep pace with what's happening in the domain?
Yeah, no, it's overwhelming. The sheer amount of information that comes out, and I think this is where people have to kind of think about what are their objectives that they're trying to do, and then make sure they tailor that information content to that. So, and let me explain. For some of us, we just want to understand what's going on in the AI industry because we know it'll somewhat impact our job. So we just need at a high level to follow, right? Who are some of the business leaders that are writing about this? What are the trends so that I'm aware of? There's other folks that might be, well, I'm thinking about transitioning into this. Like I've seen this generative AI, I've seen this piece here. Well, then you need to think about kind of a more structured process for learning. And one of the things I often caution people is follow that structured process. Like, don't read every paper, don't read every blog post like that. Like, it's good to have a little bit of that, but you also want to learn the basics and the fundamentals of how machine learning and AI works, and then plug in the latest advances because the reality is there's like 5,000 new papers every day, every year on archive. Like
Right.
2 years from now, we'll be talking about two or three of those papers, and that's it. So don't get
Yeah.
too stressed out by all the incoming information. The good quality stuff will stick around. You'll learn that. So just start by learning that other older good quality stuff, and you'll be fine like that. So I think that's one of the main lessons is don't be afraid to say no and to turn it off a little bit because there is just an overload of information right now.
Yeah, that is true. And you also run your own YouTube channel, and some of the videos there are really interesting in the way you bring out some of the challenges and importance of knowing statistics and some of the fundamentals. So what was your motivation behind starting this YouTube channel,
Yeah.
and how do you see that?
So I've always been somebody that wants to understand why, and I like telling people why things are. I love explaining things to people. And I started off, and I still do, lots of written blog posts. But I have teenagers too, and I look at my teenagers, and I had a hacking competition. Like I was trying to get my son, who was doing computer science, like let's do a little bit of the hacker ethos. Like let's build a little project because he was just doing textbook learning, and I was like, we need to go beyond that. And it took me forever to kind of persuade him to like do a little project. And I was like, okay, we'll build, like he likes Discord. We'll build a little bot for Discord that tells jokes. Right? Nothing too
Okay.
complicated, but it takes a little bit of thing to do. And so the
Yeah.
goal was we set aside one weekend to finally do this. Um, I go, I do the research, right? I kind of build the bot and kind of do that. And then I ask him how he's doing. And he's like, he's like, I didn't get very far. I got stuck. I was like, well, okay, like let's pull it up, see where you're at, and I'll help you, unstuck it. And he pulls it up, and what he pulls up is a YouTube video. And for me, this was mind blowing. Like I'm used to going to text and following text, but even
Yeah.
something like a technical walkthrough of like how to set up this Discord bot, he was watching a video, and it just at that time I'd already used TikTok a lot. I kind of share lots of videos with my kids on like TikTok, so it just pointed out to me that the world is really changing and evolving on how people learn. And so this really pushed me to, I really want to understand video. And so I decided to focus on building lots of short videos and then figuring out, if I'm talking to my son or, somebody in that kind of group of people, like what's the best way to send a message
Mm.
about, these various little nuggets of machine learning. And so nowadays I focus most of my time making kind of very short videos. I do some longer videos and some blog posts, but typically I do these really very short videos where I try to be a little bit of education on the machine learning, but also a little bit fun and keep it entertaining so people
Uh,
want to absorb it. You don't always want to just sit and listen to a lecture like that. So I've had a lot of fun posting those videos like that.
Yeah, and what have been some of the key learnings you have had? So if you have to, create or you have to share, let's say, a message, how would you do it today differently compared to, let's say, when you started?
So one thing I've done is I've left up a lot of my videos, and now I've been doing this for 2 years, and I can see in myself how I've very much improved the quality of the videos in terms of
Right.
how I can communicate that back. So I think one thing for people to do is you get better with practice. It's just whether it's coding models, whether it's making videos, just go do it. And of course, it's going to be
Right.
awful. You won't understand it the first time, but if you keep at it and you keep getting better and you keep putting in the time, you'll get better at doing it. So I think that's been an important lesson for me. Is just the repetition, getting better and better, getting the muscle memory, understanding that you improve like that. And then I've just gotten a little bit. It's forced me to get a little bit better in terms of thinking about how I communicate in concepts. Where for social media, for example, it's important to have a hook, something catchy that grabs the person's
Yeah.
attention right away.
Mhm.
It's important to have not a lot of fluff in your talk, but to get straight to the point like that. It's important to see where when you can add a little bit of humor, right? Like that, like people might like to smile and laugh, as they listen to something.
Yeah.
So adding those in. So I've learned a number of lessons like that along the way.
Right. And just tricking your brain on, if we have to think about AI creating these short videos, right?
Hmm.
So let's look at it in two layers, right? One is just creating a consistent video for, let's say, under a minute.
Yeah.
Uh, if you have to put a time frame on it, what would it be? When would it be like really possible? And then bringing in that creative element, which is where I'm presuming you spend a lot of time. What's the best way to give that message? How to bring in some humor? How far is that according to you?
Uh, Let me see. Are you trying to ask like how long the production of the videos takes? Like that? Is that what you're getting at?
No, no. I'm saying, how long do you see when AI can start coming up with, oh, you need a 1 minute video? Yeah, just give me a few prompts and I'll create a consistent video for a minute for you.
Yeah. So the AI is doing amazing things with kind of multimodal AI, with converting or converting text into voices, or taking your text and using things like Stable Diffusion, creating images or videos like that. Like I've already seen other bloggers doing that, where they can write a blog and automatically kind of make a video that gives the transcript of that. And so those tools are all getting easier to do. I think where the AI stumbles upon is it doesn't understand the material. And so for example, like
Mhm.
it can't be very humorous with the material. Like it'll make some obvious jokes, but it doesn't really understand what's going on. And so I think this is
Correct.
the limitation. So if you're just looking for something to do transcripts, the AI is really good at just kind of regurgitating out the same.
Mhm.
But the humans still, at least for now, have the advantage in being able to kind of tell nuances and little edgy things about the content. And I will tell you, I use AI all the time when I write my skits. I take my draft of my skit and I give it to ChatGPT, and we
Mhm.
have a little bit of a conversation back and forth because I want to identify any weak points, any things that are unclear. Are there easy
Yeah.
opportunities for jokes? Was there some gaps like that? So I use AI when I actually build these videos, but I don't think we're at the
Right.
point where it'll be fully automated anytime soon.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Great. Thanks for sharing that. And just want to spend a few minutes on some of the future trends which
Yeah.
you see, right? So let's say over the next few years, what are some of the things which you see evolving, developing? How do you see the next few years panning out?
Yeah, it's always tricky when you're kind of doing these types of predictions, but I mean, I mean, I think one of the biggest trends we're going to see is the ability of computers to better understand what we want. So, a simple example of that is when you talk to ChatGPT, and I think there was I saw a video the other day of somebody just having a rambling conversation, a rambling statement for 30, 40 seconds, but ChatGPT was able to understand what she was able to send and give an answer like that. And I think we're going to have this ability to take how humans often talk, right? I got lots of speaking tics. I say extra words, right? I don't actually get to the point. I'm in a long ways around. But these models are very good at being able to decipher that and get to the core of what we want. And so I think one of the things we'll see will more interfaces in more places where we can go from a little bit of this unstructured world to being able to give a structured result. So one thing is like a question answer that you might have with ChatGPT. Another thing is hey, I need to program a program that plays Space Invaders and it does like this, and you get the program. Or I'm working in a design program. Hey, I want to design a box that looks like this, and then you could describe it. So I think more we're going to have a movement towards interfaces that are more human because these models have a much more nuanced understanding of that. So I think that's one really large trend to do. But also at the end of the day, I still think we're going to be using Excel. We're still going to be, using things in Excel. We're still going to be kind of building models and looking at plots and doing all those things like that. Like that stuff isn't going away. Like learning those skills, learning how to kind of generate data with SQL, like that stuff is still going to be relevant, and people are still going to be doing those sorts of things like that. So don't think the world is radically changing and you don't need to learn that stuff. Like that stuff is going to be relevant for much, much longer. So.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating. I started my career with Excel as the main tool.
Yeah.
And then, SAS came and became more popular. And then Python came and became more popular. And at all times, there was this wave that you'll not need Excel now. And then, and in fact, I think there is a generation of data scientists who use Python as their first language versus Excel. But especially, people who get used to Excel, it's the place to go for any quick and dirty analysis. So that's great to hear.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. So, Raji, usually towards the end of the show, we ask a few rapid fire questions with our guests. So, what I want to hear is, the first thoughts which come to your
Uh-oh.
mind on the questions. So, any particular book which had a big impact on you? Any specific book which you remember?
So there's a couple of books. So
Hmm.
I read Feynman's books. I don't remember the exact title, but him as a physicist and how he interplayed life with understanding science was one of
So
those
the
books.
autobiography which you had written, surely you must be joking
Yeah,
about that,
exactly.
right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that book had a profound. And then there was another book, The Lies My Teacher Told Me, which helped me
Mhm.
understand that some of the things that we think about as conventional wisdom aren't necessarily true, and that it makes sense to sometimes dive a little deeper. And there's often more interesting stories there. So I think those are two of the things that
Wow.
have had a lasting effect on me.
Int- Interesting. And what would be a interesting, let's say, hobby project or side project to pick up today if you have to, or if you want to, rather? Mhm.
I mean, I always encourage people to pick out their own kind of side projects. I mean, for me, I spent a number of years doing sports analytics. They have
Mhm.
basketball tracking data that was available where you could watch the players as they move around the court. And so for me, it was fascinating to be able to kind of track the movement of players, build analytics based on that.
Interesting. And are you someone who prefers, staying up late at night and then working through your projects, or are you wake up early and then go through?
I like to get up early in the morning, and because I like to exercise. So if I'm going to do it, I have to kind of do that early. So I get started early in the day, and then what happens is,
Mm.
middle of the day, evening, I kind of drift off a little bit, and then usually maybe I can do an hour or two of work depending on what. But I always have to just do the fun stuff in the evening. I can't do regular work. It has to be something that can takes my mind off a little bit. So
Interesting. And if you were not in data science and AI, what other career options do you think you would have explored?
I mean, I like being a professor. That's one piece of that. Um, I was in the Coast Guard and the military for a while, and the job that I liked is, of
Mhm.
course, another kind of Y related job. Is I liked doing they called it a quartermaster, but it was the navigation. So you'd be up on the
Oh,
bridge
wow.
looking at the maps and charts, but you were figuring out where the boat was going to go, right? You could decide on that piece there. And so that was fascinating for me, is all the tools to measure and figure out exactly where the ship was, to plot to go to the next place. Like that's a thread that's endlessly fascinated me as well.
Wow, great. Thanks, Raji, for sharing those, fascinating insights, fascinating stories, and then your perspective about AI and ML. And I think tons of learning. So thanks a lot for taking time out from your schedule and sharing this with us.
Thanks so much for having me. So